The third door on the east corridor had a key that no servant was permitted to hold, and on the morning of the harvest ball, that key hung from the chatelaine at Lady Ophelia Marchgrave's waist, while she smiled at 40 guests below. Rosalind Vane stood behind the locked door with her forehead against the cold panel, listening to the orchestra tune 2 floors down, counting the minutes she had been kept from her own name. She was 25 years old. She had been born in the master bedroom of this house, in the great bed her grandfather had commissioned, and for 11 weeks she had not been permitted past the landing. Below her, the guests believed the young woman upstairs was ill. They believed she was fragile. They believed because Lady Ophelia had told them so, with the fan lifted to the exact height that made contradiction impossible, that poor Miss Vane was simply not equal to society. Rosalind pressed her palm flat to the wood and felt the vibration of the strings through it, and she did not weep, because weeping had stopped being useful in the 3rd week. You will want to know how a woman comes to be locked in the wing of a house that is legally her own. Stay with me, and be patient with the beginning, because the beginning is where the injustice hides. Her father had been Sir Henry Vane, and Sir Henry had held Wexcombe Hall for 30 years before a fever took him in the space of a single wet October. The hall and everything in it descended to Rosalind, his only surviving child, without dispute and without ambiguity, for the estate was not entailed away from the female line, and the will was plain. What was not plain in the days after the funeral was who would manage a young unmarried woman's affairs until she came fully into them. Into that small uncertainty stepped her father's sister by marriage, Lady Ophelia Marchgrave, widow of a baron, a woman who had spent her whole life close to grand houses and never once mistress of one. She came to console. She stayed to command. And by the time the frost was hard on the lawns, she had persuaded the household, the neighbors, and the family solicitor that dear Rosalind was too grieved, too delicate, too unwell to be troubled with anything at all. The persuasion was gentle at first, a cup of broth carried up instead of a place laid at table. A caller turned away with a soft word about the poor girl's nerves. A letter answered on Rosalind's behalf because writing tired her so. Then the doctor, from 3 counties away, arriving in a hired chaise, closing the bedroom door and murmuring long with her aunt in the corridor, and never once asking Rosalind a question she could answer plainly. Then the old servants let go one by one on kind pretexts, the coachman who had taught her to ride and the cook who had known her mother, each replaced by a stranger who owed nothing to the house and everything to the wages Lady Ophelia paid. Rosalind had been drowning in grief that autumn, and she had let herself be tended, because it was easier than fighting, and because some part of her wanted to be a child again in a house that still smelled of her father. She had not marked the moment the tending turned. There was no moment. It was a tide, coming in so slowly that each small surrender seemed reasonable while it was made, but only monstrous when she looked back and saw the whole beach gone under. By the time she understood that the tending had become a cage, the cage was already built, and the key already hung at another woman's waist. The man who would eventually stand in the same corridor and hear her through the door had no notion of any of it. His name was Julian Ashworth, Earl of Denholt, and he had come into Denholt 8 months before by a road he had never wanted to travel. His elder brother Edmund had been the Earl, the confident one, the one raised to it, and Edmund had died at sea when the packet ship out of Falmouth went down in a March gale with all aboard. Julian had been a second son with a small independence, and a habit of solitude and grief had made him more solitary still. He was 32. He wore mourning past the season, propriety required. And when the county said, as the county did, that the new Earl of Denholt was cold, they were not entirely wrong and not remotely right. He was a man who had learned that the people he loved could be taken between one letter and the next, and he had decided, without ever saying so, that it was safer to want nothing. He had accepted Lady Ophelia's invitation to the harvest ball at Wexcombe out of duty and neighborly obligation, and for no other reason. Wexcombe lay across the river from Denholt land, and the 2 houses had exchanged courtesies for 100 years. He did not expect to enjoy the evening. He expected candlelight and orchestra, and the particular exhausting labor of being looked at by mothers with daughters, and he expected to leave early. What he had not expected was the child. There was a child at Wexcombe that season, a boy of about 7, named Thomas, the son of the housekeeper, Mrs. Polly, who had served the Vanes for 20 years, and who had been permitted to keep her boy in the servants' quarters because Sir Henry in his kindness had wished it. On the afternoon before the ball, while the great rooms filled with hired footmen, and the smell of beeswax and forced roses, Thomas had slipped up the back stair after a kitchen cat, and had come, by the accident of a child's wandering, to the 3rd door on the east corridor. And through the gap beneath it, a voice he knew had spoken to him. Rosalind had taught Thomas his letters. Before the autumn, before the locking, she had sat with him in the morning room on rainy days and guided his hand around the shapes of words, because she remembered her own governess with love, and because a bright child going untaught seemed to her a small crime against the future. Thomas had not forgotten her. When the boy heard her voice behind the door that no one would open, he did what a loyal child does. He went to find someone tall enough to help, and the first tall stranger he found, standing alone at the terrace doors, with a glass he was not drinking, was the Earl of Denholt. Julian would remember long after that he had almost sent the boy away. He was not fond of children in the abstract, having none and expecting none, and a servant's son tugging at a gentleman's sleeve at a ball was precisely the sort of small social wrongness he had spent a year learning to freeze into stillness. Yet the boy's face was not the face of a child begging a sweet. It was frightened, and it was certain, and it said in a whisper that the lady upstairs had been shut in for ever so long, and that no one would let her out. The lady upstairs. Julian knew, as everyone in the county vaguely knew, that Sir Henry's daughter was unwell and kept quiet above. He had been told it 3 times that very evening, once by Lady Ophelia herself, who had said with a sorrowing tilt of her head that poor Rosalind was simply not equal to the world, and was better spared its demands. He had accepted it the way one accepts the weather. Now a 7-year-old was pulling his sleeve toward a back stair, and something in Julian that had been asleep for a year, some old instinct from before grief taught him to want nothing, came awake and would not lie back down. He let the boy lead him. That was the first thing. A man who had trained himself to feel nothing followed a child up a servant's stair away from the light, and he did not at the time ask himself why. The east corridor was dark and cold. The ball's warmth did not reach it. Julian stood before the 3rd door and heard, on the other side of it, the smallest sound, the sound of someone breathing very quietly so as not to be heard breathing. And he understood in one clean moment that whatever he had been told downstairs was a lie. He knocked once, softly, and he said his name, and he asked if there was someone within who wished to be free. The silence on the other side was long. Then a voice, low and steady and entirely sane, answered that there was. He did not break the door. A gentleman does not break a lady's door. And besides, the sound would have brought the whole house. Instead, he asked her name, and she gave it. Rosalind, daughter of Sir Henry, mistress of this house. He asked how long. She told him. 11 weeks. He was quiet for the space of 3 breaths, and inside that quiet, a great, cold anger organized itself in him. The first strong thing he had let himself feel since a March gale took his brother. And he found he was glad of it. He told her through the door that he would not raise an alarm, that would only let her aunt explain it all away, with a fan, and a sad word he told her to give him one day. He told her in the level voice that other people found cold, and that she would come to understand was the sound of a man deciding something and refusing to be moved, that no one would know he had heard her, and that she should say nothing, and eat what was brought, and wait. It was the first command he ever gave her. She heard it as coldness. She would learn to hear it otherwise. Then he went back down to the ball and bowed over Lady Ophelia's hand and complimented the roses. And Lady Ophelia, who read men for a living, saw nothing at all in his still face, and thought him the same dull, cold earl he had always been. That was her first mistake, though she would make a great many more before the season turned. Understand what Julian did next, because it is the measure of the man. He did not ride home and brood. He did not confront the aunt and give her the day's warning she would have used to spirit her niece somewhere quieter. He went home, and he sat down at his brother's old desk, and he wrote 3 letters. One to his solicitor in town, a careful, precise man named Mr. Tang, Kraz, Alderton, asking for the standing of the Wexcombe estate, the terms of Sir Henry's will, and the legal position of an unmarried heiress, detained by a relation with no standing as guardian. One to the parish vicar, Mr. Cotta. Bell, whom he trusted, asking him to call at Wexcombe on a pastoral pretext and to insist, kindly and immovably, on seeing Miss Vane in person. And one he did not send, that he wrote, and then folded and put in his breast pocket. And that letter had only a few lines on it, and we will come to what they were. Rosalind spent that day as she had spent the 11 weeks before it, but not as she had spent them. Something had changed in the air of her small prison. A man had heard her and had not gone away. She sat in the window seat that looked over the walled kitchen garden, and she made herself remember who she was, because the great danger of a cage is that in time you begin to believe you belong in it. She was the daughter of Henry Vane. She had run this estate at his elbow since she was 16, knew the rents and the tenants and the drainage of the low meadow better than any steward. She had refused 2 respectable offers of marriage because neither man had loved her, and she had been fool enough, or brave enough, to want to be loved. Her aunt had used that against her, had told the county that Rosalind was proud and difficult and had driven off good suitors, and had made the pride into a symptom, and the symptom into an illness, and the illness into a locked door. It was very neatly done. Rosalind, looking at it clearly for the first time in weeks, could almost admire the neatness, the way one admires the joinery of the trap that holds one's own foot. The dismissive word came to her that afternoon through the door, though her aunt did not know she heard it. Mrs. Polly had been sent up with a tray, and on the landing, Lady Ophelia's voice had drifted, speaking to the new lady's maid she had hired, a girl loyal to the wages, and not the house. Poor creature, Lady Ophelia had said, and the 2 words carried through the gap under the door as clearly as if they had been meant to. Poor creature. Rosalind sat with a tray on her knees and did not eat for a long moment, because those 2 words were the whole architecture of her imprisonment reduced to their foundation. Not mad. Merely a poor creature to be pitied and managed and kept from the light for her own good. It was the pity that locked the door. The pity was the lie that made the key acceptable. Mr. Bell the vicar came the next morning as Julian had asked, and Lady Ophelia received him in the drawing-room with tea and regret. She was very sorry, she said, but dear Rosalind was too unwell for callers, had been unwell all season, and the doctor, a man Lady Ophelia had brought from 3 counties away, and paid well, had advised complete quiet. Bell, who was gentle but not soft, said that he would very much like to pray with the young lady at her own bedside, and that his conscience as her clergyman required it, and that he would wait as long as necessary. Lady Ophelia's fan moved a half-inch higher. She said with great sweetness that she could not permit it, that the excitement would do harm. And Mr. Furr, Bell, who had buried Sir Henry and christened Rosalind, looked at the woman across the tea things and understood, as Julian had understood at the door, that something in this house was badly wrong. He did not force it. He was one man with a Bible against a chatelaine of keys. He left Wexcombe instead and rode straight to Denholt, and he told the Earl what he had seen, and the 2 of them, the cold young peer and the country vicar, sat by Julian's fire, and began, quietly and without haste, to build the thing that would open the east wing. By then Mr. Alderton's answer had come from town. It was everything Julian had hoped, and worse than he had feared. Sir Henry's will was beyond dispute. Rosalind was the sole and unqualified owner of Wexcombe Hall and its lands and its income, and she had reached her majority long since. Lady Ophelia held no guardianship, no power of attorney, no legal standing over her person or her property whatsoever. Every day the aunt kept her niece behind a locked door. She committed a plain wrong that any magistrate would recognize. The law, Mr. Alderton wrote, in the careful hand of a man who knew how the world truly ran. The law was one thing, and the doing of it was another. If they went to a magistrate with the story, Lady Ophelia would produce her paid physician, who would swear the niece was disordered and confined for her own safety. And the matter would become a slow and ugly contest of reputations, in which a delicate young woman's sanity was argued in public by strangers, and even if she won, she would be a woman the county had heard called mad. The cruelty of it was that the law's own machinery could be turned into a second cage, so they would not begin with the law. They would begin with the truth made visible in front of the very people the aunt had lied to, so that when the law came, it would only be confirming what the county's own eyes had already seen. And for that, Julian needed Rosalind herself, uncowed and clear and standing on her own feet, because a rescue does its own quiet violence to the rescued. And he had decided, without quite admitting the decision, that he would not have this woman saved as a poor creature. She would be restored as a mistress of her house, or not at all. He found his way to her. In the days that followed, by the same road, the boy had opened. Thomas carried notes. A child running errands through a great house is invisible, and Mrs. Polly, who loved Rosalind and hated what was being done to her, made sure the boy could pass. So it was that Rosalind, in her window seat above the kitchen garden, began to receive folded squares of paper in a firm, plain hand, and to answer them, and across the wood of a locked door and the width of a walled garden, two people who had never properly met began to know each other in ink. He wrote to her of practical things: the state of the will, the vicar's visit, the magistrate they would not yet trouble. He wrote nothing tender, and she read the cold letters and felt absurdly warmer than she had felt in weeks, because a man was speaking to her as though her mind were sound, and her word reliable, and her ownership of her own life a plain fact. She had not understood, until his flat unsentimental sentences arrived, how starved she had become for someone to treat her as competent. Her aunt's cruelty had worn the mask of care. This stranger's care wore the mask of business. She was learning in her prison to read the true face beneath the mask, and she was learning that the cold ones were sometimes the kind ones, and the sweet ones sometimes the cruel. There was one note she kept. He had written at the foot of a page, otherwise given over to the terms of the will, a single line that had nothing to do with the will at all. He had written that he had ridden along the river that morning, and had looked across at the east front of Wexcombe, and had found the third window from the corner, and wondered if she could see the water from it. She could. She had watched that river for 11 weeks. That he had stood on the far bank and looked for her particular window undid something in her that all his careful legal sentences had not touched, and she pressed the folded paper flat between her palms and held it a moment against her breastbone before she could make herself set it down. And her heart was doing a thing behind her ribs that she had no name for, and did not in that moment want named. She had been so long treated as a body to be managed that she had forgotten she was a body that could feel. She wrote back to him with the same plainness and more. She told him the drainage of a low meadow and the arrears of the Coombe farm rents, to prove that the invalid upstairs knew her own estate to the shilling. She told him which of the servants her aunt had turned out, and which she had bought. She told him, when he asked what she wanted, not to be rescued, but to be believed, and to walk down her own staircase on her own feet, in front of everyone who had let this happen, and to see her aunt's face when the county understood. Julian read that letter twice by his fire. He had expected fear or gratitude. He had not expected a woman who wanted, above her own freedom, the dignity of doing it in the open. Something in his chest that had been locked as tightly as her door moved, and he did not name it, but he read the letter a third time before he slept. I told you we would come to the letter he wrote and did not send. He carried it still. On the nights when he could not sleep, he took it out and looked at the few lines and did not send it, because it was not the sort of thing a cold man sends, and because the woman it was addressed to was behind a door he had not yet opened. And a declaration made to a captive is a kind of pressure, and he would not do that. He would open the door first. He would set her free, and standing and beholden to no one, and then, if there was anything to say, he would say it to a free woman who could laugh in his face and walk away if she chose. That was the shape of the man. His tenderness expressed itself as restraint, and his love, when it came, would announce itself first as the refusal to take any advantage at all. The aunt, however, was not idle, and the aunt was clever. Lady Ophelia had felt the change in the air of her house. Servants she did not trust exchanged glances. The vicar had come twice more and been turned away twice more, and each turning cost her a little in the county's regard. And she had learned, because a hired maid overheard the boy and reported for her wages, that notes were passing to the East Wing. She did not know yet from whom. She knew all the same that her control was fraying, and a clever, frightened person is more dangerous than a calm, cruel one. And Lady Ophelia made her decision. She would marry Rosalind off. Not to free her, but to move the problem into a locked box the county would approve of. There was a man, a Mr. Crail, a distant connection of Lady Ophelia's late husband, in want of money and short of scruple, who would take a strange, delicate wife and her large estate, and ask no questions, and share the proceeds with the aunt who had arranged it. A married woman's property passed to her husband. A married woman's person passed to her husband's authority. If Rosalind could be got to the altar, or got to appear to consent, then everything the aunt had built by the locked door would be made permanent and lawful in a single morning, and no vicar and no magistrate could ever undo it. Lady Ophelia announced, to the delight of the county, that dear Rosalind was so much improved that a match was in contemplation, and that the engagement would be celebrated at a dinner at Wexcombe within the fortnight, and that Miss Vane, who had been too unwell for callers, would appear. The word came to Rosalind through the door for the second time, and in a new mouth. It was Mr. Crail himself this time, brought up by the aunt to the landing to look at his purchase through a door that was, for the occasion, unlocked and held ajar by a footman, while Rosalind stood at the far side of the room. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he intends to buy cheap, and he said to Lady Ophelia, not troubling to lower his voice, that the poor creature would do well enough, and that a quiet wife was no bad thing. Poor creature. The second voicing in a stranger's mouth in the open doorway that was itself a mockery of freedom. Rosalind stood very straight and said nothing, and let them look, because she had learned that her silence frightened her aunt more than any protest, and because Julian had told her to wait, and she had decided, against everything her situation counseled, to trust the cold man's word. That night she wrote him the hardest letter, the one that told him the door had a fortnight left before it became a wedding ring. And Julian, reading it, understood that the slow, careful road of vicars and solicitors had just run out of time, and that he would have to open the door in front of the county, at the very dinner the aunt had arranged to close it forever, and turn her trap into the arena of her undoing. The days before the dinner were the longest of Rosalind's imprisonment, and the fullest. She and Julian planned it through the boy's small hands, note by folded note, and in the planning, something happened between them that neither had arranged. They stopped writing only of wills and magistrates. He wrote one night that he had lost his brother to the sea, and had not spoken his name aloud in 8 months, and that he did not know why he was telling her, except that a locked door made a strange confessional, and her handwriting had become the thing he waited for. She wrote back that she had lost her father to a fever, and had let grief make her docile, and that she would not be docile again, and that his letters had reminded her she had a spine. He wrote that he had thought himself finished with wanting anything. She read that line a dozen times. She did not answer it directly. She wrote instead, at the bottom of a note about the seating of the dinner, that when the door opened, she hoped his would be the first face she saw, and she sealed it before she could think better of it. Julian read that last line standing at his window, with the folded letter in his hand, and the thing in his chest that grief had locked came fully open at last, and he understood that he had walked up a servant's stair 11 days ago, a man who wanted nothing, and had come down over the course of 11 days and a dozen notes. A man who wanted one thing entirely. He took out the letter he had written and never sent, the one with the few lines, And he read it, and he found it was still true, and he put it back in his breast pocket to carry to the dinner. He would open the door first. He would say the rest to a free woman. Here is a small thing to hold on to in the last stretch of the story, and then I will not interrupt again. Watch the key. Watch the chatelaine at the aunt's waist, and the boy at the edge of every room, and the letter over Julian's heart. They will all three matter before the candles burn down. The night of the engagement dinner. Wexcombe Hall was lit as it had not been lit since Sir Henry died. Lady Ophelia had spared nothing, because the dinner was to be her masterpiece, the public transformation of a locked girl into a willing bride, and she wanted witnesses of quality. 30 places were laid in the long dining room. The county came in its silk and its diamonds. Mr. Crail came in a new coat he could not afford, wearing the smile of a man about to be rich. And the Earl of Denholt came, cold and correct in his mourning blue, and bowed over the aunt's hand and praised the table, and took the place that had been given him near the foot, and waited. Rosalind was brought down at the appointed hour. Her aunt had dressed her carefully, in a gown chosen to suggest fragility, pale and simple, and had coached her with soft threats about what a scene would cost her, and had counted above all on the 11 weeks of silence and dark to have done their work, to have made the girl small and pliant and grateful for any hand that led her. Lady Ophelia walked her niece to the head of the table on her own arm, presenting her, and the county looked and saw a pale young woman, and prepared to believe whatever it was told about her. The young woman did not keep her eyes down, though. She lifted them, and she looked the length of the table, past the candles and the diamonds, and the man in the new coat who owned her by morning, and she found, near the foot, the one still face she had asked for. Julian met her eyes and did not smile, because a smile would have told the room too soon, but he inclined his head the smallest degree. A bow meant for her alone, and Rosalind understood that the door was about to open, and she straightened her spine another quarter inch, and the aunt at her side felt the stiffening, and did not yet know what it meant. Lady Ophelia rose to make her announcement. She spoke beautifully. She spoke of her dear niece's recovery, of the tender care that had restored her, of the happy union in prospect with Mr. Dacian. Crail. And she lifted her glass, and the county lifted its glasses, and it was all going exactly as she had built it. The locked door about to become a wedding, the theft about to become a settlement, the whole clean, neat trap about to close for good. And, into the small silence before the toast, the Earl of Denholt stood up. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He said into a room of 30 people holding raised glasses that before anyone drank to this engagement, the county should know that Miss Vane had been kept these 11 weeks behind a locked door in her own house against her will and her law, and that the woman proposing the toast held the key to that door at her own waist at this moment. The room did not move. Lady Ophelia's glass stayed up, and her face performed the sorrowing pity she had performed all season, and she said in the sweet, ruined voice of a woman reaching for the old lever, that the poor creature had been ill, that the Earl had been sadly imposed upon, that dear Rosalind was not equal to. She got no further, because Rosalind stepped away from her aunt's arm into the center of the room, on her own feet, and spoke for herself in a voice that carried to every corner, and shook not at all. She said that she was Rosalind Vane, daughter of Sir Henry, sole and lawful mistress of Wexcombe Hall, of sound mind and full age, and that she had been imprisoned in the East Wing by her aunt, who had no right over her person or her property, and that she was very well acquainted with the drainage of her own low meadow and the arrears of her own Coombe farm rents. And would any physician in England care to examine those accounts and pronounce her mad? She said it without heat and without a single tear, and the county, which had come to watch a fragile girl consent to a marriage, sat looking instead at a landowner, reciting her own affairs with perfect command, and one by one, around that long table, the faces changed. That was the moment the lie died. Not when the Earl accused, when the woman the Earl had freed stood up and proved, out of her own mouth and her own knowledge, that she had never been anything but sane. Lady Ophelia's fan came up out of long habit, and then had nowhere to go, and came down again. She looked for the pity she had traded on all season, and found the room's face turned against her, and she reached, in the last extremity, for Mr. Crail and Mr. Prail. Crail, who was a coward and a fortune hunter but not a fool, had already understood that there was no fortune here for him that would not be contested in every court in the land, and he set down his glass and stepped back from the table and away from her, and in that small public step the aunt's whole architecture came down. She did not shriek. She was not the shrieking kind. She simply seemed all at once to grow smaller in her chair, an aging woman in a grand borrowed room who had gambled everything on a locked door and a fan held at the right height, and had just watched the county she ruled by decide in the space of 2 speeches that they had been made fools of. Vicar Bell rose from his place and said quietly that he had tried 3 times to see Miss Vane and been turned away, and would swear to it. The magistrate's brother, who happened to be at the table, said that the law would want a word with Lady Ophelia in the morning. The county did the aunt's punishing for her, in the only currency that had ever mattered to her, which was their regard, and they took it back from her all at once and entirely, and that was punishment enough, and no one raised a hand or a voice, and it was worse for her than if they had. Rosalind did not gloat. She had promised herself she would not, and she did not. She looked at her aunt, the woman who had tended her in grief, and then built a cage out of the tending, and she felt, to her own surprise, more weariness than triumph. She said only that Lady Ophelia would leave Wexcombe in the morning, and that she might go to her own small house in Bath, and that she would not be pursued through the courts if she went quietly, and that this was more mercy than had been shown to Rosalind, and that it was all the mercy there was. It was justice measured to the exact weight of the wrong, and not 1 grain heavier, and the county, watching, understood that the fragile girl they had been lied to about was in truth the strongest person in the room. Then, in the settling quiet, with the candles guttering and the diamonds forgotten, Julian crossed the length of the room to where she stood. He did not make a speech. He had promised himself he would not, and the woman before him had earned the right to a man who did not perform his feelings at her. He took the folded letter from his breast pocket, the one he had written the first night, and carried for 11 days, and never sent, and he put it into her hand. And he said in the level voice that she had once mistaken for coldness, and now knew for the sound of a man who meant a thing with his whole life, that he had written it to a captive and would not send it to a captive, and that she was free now and might read it, and might throw it in the fire, and either would be well. Rosalind unfolded the letter in front of the whole county, which had no notion what it was, and read the few lines to herself. What they said was not for the room and is not quite for us, but it was short, and it named no fortune, and no estate, and no advantage, and it asked her, a free woman with a house of her own, and no need of any man, whether she might one day want him for no reason but himself. She read it, and she looked up at him, and for the first time in 11 weeks, and for the first time in the whole length of this story, she smiled, and she did not throw it in the fire. They were not married that week, nor the next. She had had quite enough of being managed toward an altar, and he, of all men, understood that a woman just out of a cage does not want to be walked into anything, however kind. He courted her slowly across the river and back, all through the turning of the autumn into winter, and the county watched the cold earl thaw by degrees in the presence of the woman he had freed, and thought it the best thing they had seen in years, and quite forgot they had ever believed her mad. There was an afternoon in November that she would keep the rest of her life. They had walked the river path together, properly attended, saying little, and at the old stile where the footway crossed the hedge he had handed her over as any gentleman would, and his hand had closed around hers through her glove, and neither of them had let go on the far side. They had stood there in the cold, bright air with their 2 hands joined, and the river running below, and Mrs. Bree, Polly discreetly examining a hawthorn some distance off, and he had looked at their hands and then at her face, and had not said a word, and she had felt her own pulse in her wrist, where his fingers pressed loud as a clock, and had understood that he was giving her the moment to withdraw and would think no less of her if she did. She did not withdraw. That was all that happened. It was everything. He raised her gloved knuckles the smallest distance toward his mouth, and stopped deliberately before he arrived, because some things are sweeter held, just short of themselves, and set her hand down gently, and they walked on. She thought about that unfinished gesture for a week. Mr. Bell married them at the parish church in the first week of December with Mrs. Misha. Polly, weeping happily in the second pew, and the boy Thomas, scrubbed and solemn in a new coat, standing up as proudly as if the whole affair had been his doing, which, in the truest sense, it had. On the evening of her wedding day, Rosalind Ashworth, Countess of Denholt, walked through Wexcombe Hall, which was hers still and always would be, opening doors. She went at last to the east corridor, to the third door, and she found that Julian had been there before her. The lock was gone. In its place he had fitted a plain new handle that turned from either side, and on the little table beneath the window where she had sat out her captivity, he had set the old iron key, the one from her aunt's chatelaine, not thrown away and not hidden, but laid there in plain sight where she could see it whenever she chose, and know that it opened nothing, any more she picked it up. It was cold and heavy and ordinary, a thing that had held her life shut for 11 weeks, and now held nothing at all, and she turned it over once in her hand, and set it down again, and left the door standing open behind her. Snow was falling when she came down the great staircase on her own feet, the way she had promised herself she would, and the hall below was warm with firelight, and her husband was waiting at the bottom, not to lead her, only to be there when she arrived. Thomas had fallen asleep by the hearth with the kitchen cat in his lap. Mrs. Polly was humming somewhere toward the kitchens. The key lay upstairs on a table by an open door, going quietly to rust, and would rust there for 50 years, harming no one, opening nothing. A small, cold thing in a house that had learned to keep all its doors unlocked. If Rosalind's long climb down that staircase has stayed with you, I hope you will carry it a little way into your own evening. Thank you for staying with her and with me until the very end.